Hi, welcome back to your virtual learning space. This is video 6. As always, if you learned something interesting, go teach someone immediately. It's a great tool. I hope that you've been using it. I use it all the time in my own life. People will people will get unwelcome text messages at all hours of the morning because I've learned something interesting and I gotta share it. So, where on the plan are we? We're going to be in zone 1, which is the blue area. So it's the area around my driveway. It's where I put my herb spiral. It's the deck at the back of the house and the pond. And it's also my shed. But we won't really talk about the potting shed for the moment. So we're in the daily visits area. This is where we're going to have our picking greens. This is where we're going to have our composting and working areas. And this is where we're going to have our animal houses, the things that we need to visit every day. In my zone 1, we have the pond. This is kind of like an animal house. It needs daily maintenance. It needs daily attention. So it's right by the back door. We're going to talk about the compost worm farm in my house. So it's right outside the back door. Again, right up against zone 0. And we're going to talk about pollinators and pollinator fodder. So that's one of my primaries. Like I said, my mom likes to have the flowers and the bees and the butterflies around her. She likes that beautiful nature. So this is part of my zone 1 plan. We'll start off with compost worms. So what's a compost worm? The first thing we need to know about compost worms is that they do not live in the soil. Compost worms live in organic matter. So if we put them in the soil, they will just die. They live literally in that tiny slice right at the top of our soil where there's lots of organic material being cycled. The most common ones that we use are red wrigglers and tiger worms. This picture here is of tiger worms. Guess where they got their name? They got the little tiger stripes on them. And red wrigglers are slightly bigger and they're like a little bit more pink. Worms are just digesting machines. So if you think of them like a long intestine wrapped in skin, they kind of push through the soil. As they do, they push food into their mouth and then out the other side. We get worm castings, which are highly valuable. So as they're passing through the soil, or in this particular instance, as they're passing through our organic material, they're obviously quite a soft little thing. They're very much just a skin wrapped around an intestinal system. They breathe through their skin. They don't have many other organs apart from that digestion system. They prefer a warm, moist habitat. So we want to keep their habitat constantly watered, but not like sodden. We want to keep it constantly moist. And when I say warm, I just mean that they need to be kind of north of 8 or 9 degrees Celsius to about maybe 15 or 18. So we want to keep them in a kind of a balanced space. We don't want them to get too hot. We don't want them to get too cool. And we definitely don't want them to get dried out. When we're feeding them, we want to avoid acidic additions. So things like citrus peels or chopped up citrus fruit would be to be avoided. We can balance these things out. We'll talk a little bit about pH and acids and bases as we go on. But for the moment, we could just say that the compost worms prefer a more basic environment, a more alkaline environment. And if we add acid to their area, they've got really thin skin and it hurts them. So they're not as productive. Right? So here's my compost worm farm. It's a recycled water butt for capturing rainwater. You can see there's an inlet at the top where we allow the system to breathe. So it breathes in and out through that hole. And we have an insect screen on the inside of that. So I don't want insects getting in and out. Obviously, I want to just give this food to my compost worms. At the bottom, we've got a tap to let out the liquid. And we'll talk about that as we go on. So if we were to cut that in half, what we'd see is large rocks at the bottom, smaller kind of gravelly stuff on top of that. Then there's a layer of manure. I got my manure from an organic dairy nearby. And I just had to make sure that they hadn't wormed their animals before they gave me this manure, because we don't want any of the worming chemicals in the manure because it will kill my worms, right? And on top of that layer of manure, we have just um, a little scattering of clippings from the garden. So it's just grass clippings, and that's just to keep the smell down and to keep the insects out, right? So on top of that, we put our worm food. And worm food is a very, very broad um, compost input. So we're talking about things like fruit and vegetable scraps, but we're also talking about things like newspaper and cardboard. They'll eat everything that you put into the system as long as it's wet enough and as long as it's not acidic, right? They will just munch through stuff. And it's fantastic to watch because it goes from being your leftovers from the kitchen to this beautiful, thick, black, heavy soil compost. It's fantastic what they do. So outputs from this system, we're going to get worm juice, which is an incredibly potent organic fertilizer. Now, this stuff is rocket fuel for the soil. It can be applied neat, but I think that's a little bit of a waste because if you can water it down 10 or even 100 times, it's still as effective, which is something that you don't get from a chemical fertilizer. This stuff is full of micronutrients and life, basically. It's kind of like giving probiotics to our soil. We also get worm compost, which is where the worms have basically traveled up from the manure, pulled down some food, and they're making these little channels and they're constantly creating this brand new soil. And the worm compost is obviously steeped in the worm juice. So when it comes to planting things, worm compost is invaluable. It's one of the best planting mediums I've ever used. Kian, you had a question.
One, would I be correct in saying that's in constant shade, considering the
Yes,
sun we have now? Yeah.
right.
Okay.
But it's still close enough to the house that it's not getting cold.
Okay.
Right. So it's going to feed off the warmth of the house, so it's going to stay relatively balanced.
Very good. And two, the color, does it matter?
No, you can use any container you want. Most of the ones that I've built before in the past have been in baths. So you take like someone's throwing out an old bathtub. You take the bathtub, you put it into the garden, you put like a little bucket underneath the sinkhole, you fill it the same way, you fill it with rocks, then gravel, then a layer of manure, and you add to the top, normally putting like a carpet over the top of it. Carpet works quite well because it allows water in and air out and kind of allows it to breathe. But in this particular instance, I had something to recycle, so I used that. So when my dad feeds them, he occasionally goes hunting for some worms and feeds them to his fish. Like I've said, my dad really loves his fish. I don't particularly want my worms to be going into the pond, but this is an output which my system creates, occasional fish treats. Cool. Were there any other questions about worm compost? Yeah, Dave, what can I do for you?
How do you extract the compost if it's
At the end of the season, so at the start of next growing season, I just push that over and I scoop out scoop out all the compost and isolate the worms. So I leave the worms in there and I put in new manure and I start the system all over again. So it kind of cycles for 1 year. And by the start of next growing season, I'll be able to completely harvest. But yeah, it's just a case of kind of pushing it over and tipping it out. It is quite heavy.
I'd imagine so. So the worms obviously reproduce themselves and
Absolutely. They self-regulate their population depending on how much food you put in.
right.
You put in more food, there will be more worms. And they will eat their body weight every day.
Cool. All right. Thank you.
Perfect. Moving on. So I've been asked a lot about herb spirals, and I just want to cover them in theory because I don't have one to show you. I do have a plan to put one in my my system, but I just haven't had a chance yet. Here's a picture from Gaia's Garden by Toby Hemingway. And here's another picture from the Permaculture Designer's Manual by Bill Mollison. So if we take the two of these pictures, one being a top view and one being a bit more of like a 3D view, we can see that the herb spiral is a three-dimensional shape, right? It's not like laying out a garden on the ground. We lay it out in height as well as in space. So the reason that we do this is to wrap the edge. We want to wrap that edge all the way around so that we're minimizing any waste. There is no path here. The whole point of this system is that you never step on it, but you can reach any part of it by standing along the outside edge. It's about 6 foot wide and about 3 foot tall. So everybody can reach all the way to the inside, even little kids. I'm not going to go through the plant list that is on the Gaia's Garden diagram, because everybody can read what that is, and these are all interchangeable. It's more about the microclimates that we create. So as we can see, there's a shadow along the bottom edge there. That's indicating that the sun side is at the top of the diagram, right? So we would assume that the top half of the diagram is in full sun at least some of the day, right? And at the back is mostly in shade. So that's creating two separate climates. Then if we take into account that the water we put into this system will drain more quickly from the top than it will from the bottom, we also create a dry zone at the top and a wet zone at the bottom. So in this way, we're creating 4 mini climates, microclimates on this system. That means that if a plant prefers to be shady and moist, it can go in that area. If it prefers to be shady and dry, it can go in the area that it's designed for. But if there's plants that want full sun and lots of moisture, we're going to put them right in that number 1 spot. So my number 1 would normally be mint, but he's got feverfew here. It's all about what you're looking for. And each of these numbers here correspond to a different microclimate. And the best way to work it out is, what plants do you use for cooking every day? What plants are you using in your omelette in the morning? What do you like to add to your stir fry? These are the things that we would add to a herb spiral because it's right outside our back door. We want to be able to access these things at a moment's notice when we're cooking. We don't want to be walking a half mile to go get some mint to make a cup of tea, right? These are really good at conserving resources. So because we've wrapped that edge, we've contained that space very effectively. And because we've moved up and down in altitude, we've also contained different ecosystems and made the space even more effective. One last thing that we can do is we can add a sprinkler just where we see number 14 there. And that sprinkler can cover the whole system, because it would just be sprinkling out a circle, and it can cover this whole system without having to waste water.
Alex, can you just point where 14 is? Bad eyesight.
14 is right here on the top.
You can't, there's, 14.
See this area? Can you see my mouse?
Yeah.
Yeah. So there'd be a little sprinkler right here at the top, and that can water the whole system. Rather than coming in with our normal system and spraying lots with our hose, we can just use that system to water very carefully, conserving our resources. Right? So moving on back to my spot, we're going to talk about the pond a little bit. Now, our pond has koi, and they need their water to be clean and oxygenated. For this, I've been using a gravel filter for the last 3 years now. And it is this kind of grayish brown plastic water butt sitting in behind our pond. And you can see it's nicely camouflaged by some fake plants. It's like a sniper hiding in the grass, right? So if I was to cut that down the middle what we would see is kind of like what we were talking about with the compost worms. At the bottom, we have a false bottom. That's where the pump is. So water collects in that area and gets pumped back into the pond. If we start from the top, we've got big kind of stones, then smaller stones and gravel, and then the yellow is sand. So as water comes in from the pond, it infiltrates through our stones, gravel, and sand and comes out the bottom clean of particles. So all the particles that were in the water have been caught by our filter. Yeah? And because all these particles and all these little bits of life are being caught in the stones and all the little gaps in between, we're actually creating tiny little ecosystems for all of our bacteria to live in. We've been adding food to that system so that our bacteria eat that food. We promote the bacteria that eat the food that we're putting in. And the food that we're putting in is the dirty water that the koi don't want to live in. And the result is that we get clean water out the other side that's been biofiltered. So it is as clean as it needs to be for them to continue having a great life. And when it comes out of that system, it goes into a little waterfall which oxygenates the water. Again, helping our koi to be as healthy as possible. So this system is incredibly low maintenance. Anyone who's ever owned a pond knows how much of a pain it is to clean filters. And it can be something that has to be done every 2 weeks, every month, every 2 months. And it normally involves replacing a filter. So we're talking about like constantly consuming. Whereas our system, we tip it out onto the grass once a year. We change the sand, we wash the rocks, we put it all back together. That's our system for cleaning out this filter. And we only have to do that once a year. Right? I do have a bypass set up on this system so that I can take water straight from the pond and put it into an aquaponics system. I'll explain that in the next slide. Cian, you had a question?
Just really quickly, if you were to set this up, like there's obviously like certain ratios you'd have to look at with the sand versus the rocks. Like,
yeah, you want to be just kind of going for a third of each.
However high you want it to go, it's not really that important. Having enough sand is probably the most important part. You want to make sure you have at least 6 inches to 8 inches of sand.
okay, so there's no
That's going to
that gets you a year. Like,
no, exactly. There's no particular formula for it.
The sand is going to be the most important layer because it catches the tiny, tiny particles that would make our pond kind of murky, right? Cool. Perfect. So we're going to talk a little bit more about aquaculture. That's just literally agriculture for the water. Aquaponics is a great place to start. Last week we were talking about hydroponics in the house, and that's where we use like a clay medium and we flush the roots of the plants with a nutrient-dense mix, right? Here, we're just going to use the fish manure water as our nutrient-dense mix to promote our plants growing and to clean that water for the fish, right? Here's a really, really simple little system that I saw online. I'd love to have one. It looks like a lot of fun. So everyone likes a little goldfish in the kitchen. This goldfish is supporting these plants above it. So the water is being pumped out of the goldfish bowl and into the plant's substrate, the growing medium for the plants, and feeding them, subsequently cleaning the water before it comes back into the fish bowl. It's a self-cleaning fish bowl that has some herbs growing in it, right? What a fantastic idea. So depending, again, we're talking about like scale and cost. If you wanted to sustain yourself with an aquaponics system, you can invest a lot of money and receive dual yields. You can grow fish that you are going to eat, as well as all your veggies with a system like this. Now, that's not to say that you should invest that money, and it's a lot involved and you'd have to learn a lot, but we can put it into smaller use. So like I said, I've got a little bypass set up on my dad's fish pond, and I'm hoping that next season I'm going to set up a small aquaponic system to grow our salad greens from the manured water in our pond. So like it's that idea of using what would be termed a waste product to then feed another part of the system, closing more of those loops, keeping the energy in our system. Daily supervision with these systems is very important. So we have to obviously monitor that all our pumps and mechanical stuff is working properly, or the plants won't get fed and the water from the fish won't get cleaned. So our fish can die and our plants can die if we're not daily supervising these systems. There's also like a pH that we have to maintain. So we have to keep it in a certain range between acid and base. Does everyone here know what the pH scale is? Yeah? Cool, perfect. So we want to be keeping it somewhere between 6.5 and 7.5. We want to keep it right in that medium happy area. Very important to maintain our pH, the pH of our soil, which I'm going to talk about in the next section, but also this system can become very acid very quickly and kill our fish if everything isn't working like once again, this is a great way to conserve resources. We're not wasting any water. There's no water being expelled from this system. We might lose a small bit to evaporation, but apart from that, everything is being used. Conserving resources is incredibly important. I'm going to be talking about it a lot from here on forward. Zone 1, 2, 3, all the way up to zone 5. It's all about conserving the resources that we have so that we can be as effective as possible. So in the last part of this video, we're going to talk about pollinators. Now, everybody loves some pollinators, whether they know it or not, because pollinators are what make plants work. Most of the plants that we understand have flowers of some description. We could talk about ferns, which are an older form of plant, and they don't have flowers. They pollinate by spores. They send out spores into the environment. But for our purposes, most of the plants that we'll be dealing with have some sort of flowering cycle. And what they do is they send out a flower to attract pollinators. They need pollinators to reproduce. So pollinators spread pollen, and it's just any creature that does that. There's a wide range of birds, insects, and mammals that spread pollen from one flower to the next to the next. Pollen is the male genetic material from a flower, and it needs to be brought to the female part of a flower on another plant. Right? No pollinators, no food. I'm sure everybody's heard about the latest collapses in bee populations, which has a lot of people very, very worried. Because of all the pollinators, the bees are probably the biggest sector that we see. We can see bees because they stand out so much, but they only form a very small chunk of the overall pollination cycle. Like there are tons of pollinators, and we want to be supporting them in any way we can. Because if we don't support them, they don't support our systems which feed us. So how do we encourage them to live here? In my particular instance, I don't need to create any habitat. I've got a lot of habitat around me already. I've got a woods kind of straight across the road, and there's various different little nooks and crannies for them to be living in my property. But I do need to create fodder. I do need to create flowers for them to eat, because they eat the nectar from the flowers as a general rule. And the trade-off that the flower gives them the food so that it spreads its pollen. It wants lots of pollinators to visit it so that it can widely distribute its genetic material, leading to more reproduction on our plants. And reproduction in our plants for us can mean fruit, it can mean berries, it can mean a whole multitude of things. But it is very important that our plants have the ability to reproduce. Because some plants, like annuals, only live for 1 year. They only live for one season. And if they don't pass on their genetic material, they pass on. and they're no longer part of our system. Was there any questions on pollinators? Did everyone understand that? Perfect. Cool. Well, that's the end of our little piece on zone 1. So thank you so much for watching. I hope you got a ton of value out of this video. Stay tuned. In the next video, we're going to cover zone 2. As always, if you learned something interesting, please go teach someone immediately. Have a great day.